Horror has gone through its own trials and tribulations. It has high moments and the lowest of lows. But even with all the ups and downs, it's still one of the most successful genres in movies, video games, and podcasts. The reason behind the success can be explained by the fact that humans feel a stimulation that is both mental and physical and sometimes emotional while consuming the genre. But just like trends, they come and go. And there have been many horror games that impacted the genre, which forced a new norm, a new way to consume. It kept things fresh for a while, but now, in 2024, it's becoming stale again. So let's dive into every horror game that made the biggest ripple in the genre. Let's start off by talking about the types of horror games that exist today. We have survival horror, like House of the Dead, Left 4 Dead, The Last of Us, and Dead Space. The idea behind some of these games is that the protagonist is someone who is able to fight back, utilizing any weapon they can get their hands on in order to survive until the end. While it is still part of the horror genre, I don't ever worry about playing these games knowing I have a Mossberg 500 in my back pocket, ready to make anyone rethink their life decisions. I mean, sure, I was scared of Jack when I first met him in Resident Evil 7, but after I found a shotgun, I wasn't really scared of him anymore. So if you ever find yourself stuck in the middle of nowhere with a guy that can die and is coming after you, maybe have a shotgun in your back pocket. You might live. But then we have psychological horror, and it's a huge hit or miss with this one. There are a lot of games that try to mess with your brain and what you see. Sometimes they never reveal the enemy until the very end. You realize that the enemy were the friends we made along the way. One of the biggest examples of this is the Silent Hill series, where it combines both survivor and psychological horror in a beautiful atmosphere over some great tunes. And then we have the game that just rely on jump scares. The biggest example is Five Nights at Freddy's, where you remain stationary and try to live until 6 a.m. Under technicality, all of these games can be considered survival horror, but these are just simply subcategories or different genres of types of horror. And finally, we have multiplayer horror. Games like Dead by Daylight, Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and finally the Evil Dead game. The multiplayer aspect of it relies on one player being the villain and the rest being the survivors, and every trial plays out differently than the other. These games after a while lose their sense of horror. A prime example of this is Dead by Daylight, where the game now feels more scary when you play killer and worry about being bullied by people who have over 10,000 hours. I will be diving into every subgenre of horror that I mentioned, but first, I would like to pay homage to someone. Epic, dude. The Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972, is the first video game console where it relies on simple shapes like squares and lines, and it's the first console to play ping pong. Along with the console came overlays, simple pieces of plastic that you place over your TV screen and use the shapes to play the game. It came out with 12 different games, and one of the games that was included was Haunted House. It's a two-player game where a detective tries to find clue cards without being caught by the ghost. This game was remade in 1982 for the Atari 2600, and this time you control a pair of eyes and try to find 3 pieces of magical urn around the 24-room mansion and return them to the entrance. Of course, you still have to avoid ghosts, but they also added spiders and bats. It's completely different how horror seems now, considering most games look like this.
You bring the police to my door, to my rig.
I can sort this, right? I just need time.
Don't you answer me back! You're fired. You hear me? Fired.
And being the first ever horror game, it paved the way for future developers. Even when it was as simple as squares and lines, it gave the stimulation that every person desires when they play a horror game. Of course, relying on IPs is the cornerstone of a guaranteed successful launch. And in 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie released, and 9 years later, in 1983, the Atari released a video game adaptation of it. Compared to the 2023 release, I say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had a huge overhaul. So now that we know a bit of history behind how horror games started, let's talk about the ones that made the most impact and how it changed the genre today. The first ever game to be considered horror is Shiryu Sensen: War of the Dead. It was released in 1987 by Fun Factory for the MSX and PC-88 home computers. It's an RPG that has 2 perspectives, top-down for exploration and becomes side-scroller during combat. You play as Leela, a member of the Super Special Force SWAT, and you are tasked to rid Chunny Hill of monsters after several police force members had not returned from the town. The gameplay side style is a giant fetch quest. You have modern dungeons like a school or a hospital, and you have to find survivors and bring them back to the only safe place that happens to be a church. Now, while this is technically the first horror game, the studio behind it, Fun Factory, no longer exists, and due to its limited release, the game is obscure to many, but it does have a lot of references to other horror movies, like the priest in the church is named Carpenter, a nod to the film director John Carpenter, or Cronenberg, another great film director that made movies like The Brood and Scanners. The game ultimately goes under the radar for many. The original had a day and night cycle that gave a feel of horror and gave everyone the stimulation they wanted. This was removed for the PC Engine release. Oddly enough, the story reminds me of a lot of Resident Evil. The lonely police member tries to save others. While it is generic, it's somewhat nice to see older games using the same plotline. Although for a time, I'm sure it was a fresh idea. Now, Capcom is no stranger to setting things in motion. In 1989, they released Sweet Home for the NES, a psychological RPG based on the Japanese movie that came out the same year. And if the name sounds familiar to you, then you'll know that Netflix released 3 seasons of a show with the same name, where I only liked the first season. The game follows the same plotline as the movie, however, the writers took the liberty to expand further on the story. 30 years prior, the painter Ichiro Mamiya hid several frescoes in his mansion. 5 documentary filmmakers then set out to find them in the abandoned manor. Once they walk inside, a ghost of an unknown woman locked them in and swears to kill all trespassers. There are also several other monsters inside the house. The team finds a projector, and when they turn it on, an image appears of a couple and their baby burning. They learn that the ghost is the wife of Ichiro, and 30 years ago, her child, who was 2 years old, fell into the incinerator and was burnt alive. Lady Mamiya tried to set up playmates for her son by killing other children, and later committed suicide, and her ghost was trapped in the house, unable to forgive herself. Jesus Christ. Alright. How the fuck am I supposed to? I don't even know how to transition from that. Each character has his or her own unique skill, and everyone is important but not needed. So if any character dies, they will not be able to be revived unless you start a new game. There are also multiple endings to this. You know what? That kind of sounds familiar. The game was released in Japan only due to its gruesome imagery, and it did not help the fact that during this time, role-playing games weren't a massive hit, especially JRPGs. However, in the year 2000, a fan-translated game released as a ROM image that you can download and play today. I really do love preserving games. The translation did take over a year to complete, but it is better than to let it die in obscurity. Thanks to Capcom and Sweet Home, they managed to establish the horror genre, making it a staple in the video game industry and inspiring many others to create their own horror. In 1995, D was released for the 3DO interactive multiplayer. The entire gameplay is an interactive movie where you have to beat it in 2 hours without pauses or saves. Developed and directed by Warp President Kenji Ino and published by Panasonic. Kenji had several other games released, but none gotten the same recognition. However, the story of D was influential to the future of horror games. It talks about Lauren Harris, who received a call from the Los Angeles Police Department telling her that her father went on a killing spree in the hospital where he works as a doctor and barricaded himself in a room. She drives all the way to the hospital and witnesses all the bodies and covers her face, only to remove her hands and see that she has been transported to a castle. Then she begins her search and has a lot of flashbacks of her mother being to death. Eventually, she learns that her father is at the top of the castle. Once she reaches him, he warns her to stay away as he is transforming into a vampire, then tells her the secret to her family, that they are descendant of Dracula, and that she killed and ate her mother when she was a child, but that memory was erased by her father. There are 2 endings to this game. One is where you approach Dr. Harris and he eats you and makes his full transformation. However, there is another ending if you manage to get a gun earlier in the game. During this ending, you shoot your father and the game ends with Laura holding her father in her arms sobbing. D is the third ever first-person horror game released, and thanks to the dark overtones of the game, having your father murder innocent people and eventually ending him yourself, it opened the door for many other games to create dark narrative that set apart the horror from the messy story. The best example I can think of is The Last of Us, where the storyline and plot overshadows every bit of horror that the game has to offer. While clickers are scary, I needed to see what happens in the story.
Okay.
It didn't take long for Capcom to change the genre yet again by releasing another horror title, and with this one, they cemented the horror genre forever. In 1996, they released the first game of the popular series Resident Evil, and it blew everyone's minds. With the stationary camera placement and tight corridors of a mansion in the Arklay Mountains, you have a chance to play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, both having different abilities and a slightly different storyline. With Chris, you're able to use weapons more effectively and start with a lighter that can solve certain puzzles early on. With Jill, you start with extra inventory slots and have a lockpick for some doors that Chris will need a key for. A little fun fact for you. The original name of the game in Japan is Biohazard. When the game was meant to release for Europe and America, the director of communications in Capcom, Chris Kramer, told them that it would be difficult to secure the copyright because of another game called Biohazard Battle and a metal band that uses the same name. Capcom then made a company-wide contest for a new name, and they landed on Resident Evil because it takes place in a mansion and the residents were evil. Chris thought the name was cheesy, but the marketing department loved it. The game was highly rated across every outlet. Famitsu, a Japanese video game magazine, gave it a 38 out of 40 rating. Meanwhile, D, the previous game a year ago, has gotten a 33. The game sold 4 million units worldwide and made $200 million, which is close to $400 million in 2024 thanks to inflation. It's now clear that Capcom and Resident Evil are the be-all end-all for horror in 1996, and the game is no stranger to clones either. When it came down to it, others tried copying the success of Resident Evil, like Blue Stinger and Deep Fear, both coming out a few years after the initial release, and if this is the first time you hear those names, then it's safe to say that they did not make much impact on the genre, unlike Capcom and Resident Evil. The PlayStation 1 was very limited with its capabilities, so of course Capcom knew what they were doing by making the setting of the game a small confined space that will limit or eliminate the loading time. So imagine thinking you're riding high on the back of a successful game for 3 years and some dude named Kiichiro Toyama comes along and drops the hardest release of 1999, Silent Hill, put psychological horror on the map. Even with its limited capabilities, they utilize fog as a means to load the direction you are walking. The story is even better. You play as Harry Mason, who was driving to Silent Hill with his adoptive daughter, Cheryl. Along the way, he gets into an accident by veering off the road to avoid hitting a random person. Harry comes to and finds out that his daughter has gone missing. So he begins this search around Silent Hill and quickly discovers that the town is not a safe place. Deformed creatures, dark atmosphere, haunting sounds and music. Silent Hill has managed to do what others couldn't, and that's striking fear into the heart of Capcom. That's what I would have liked to say if the game had a massive success. However, the real numbers are completely unknown, but fans speculated that Silent Hill sold only 2 million copies. Now, it's not something to scoff at, but you'll understand in a second. Regardless, this video is not about who outsold who. It's about the impact. And with Silent Hill, they delivered enough to have a cult following that loves the series to this day. Silent Hill is the reason why fog effect is used in so many games and movies, and not to mention the dead-end roads and the abandoned buildings, just to give the town a feeling that it was once alive and thriving. And the multiple endings that allowed for a lot of replayabilities and different playstyles is another factor. And we only see the town from the perspective of Harry Mason, so we never see what someone else is experiencing. Some might not see monsters at all. some might see worse than what we see. That's what Silent Hill offered the players. Your own designed hell, and whatever you decide will affect how the town sees you. One of my favorite Silent Hill games, and possibly the least popular one, is Shattered Memories. If the player looks at a woman's clothing for too long, or if he stares at someone's breasts, or even calls a number in the school and gives a creepy vibe, the game changes the entire personality of the main character based on how you act. It's my favorite thing to watch Harry act differently every time I play the game. For the year 2000, Capcom released Code Veronica for the Dreamcast, which sold pretty well, but no other games were of note or made much of a difference in the genre. But in 2001, Konami made a massive return and outselling its previous game by releasing the lovable Silent Hill 2. And this is by far one of the best entries in the entire series. It had such a massive impact that they decided to remake this one instead of the first one. But also, it's their most successful game of the series. I can't exactly tell you the number since they're still a mystery, but fans again speculated that it sold 2.1 million. The story talks about James Sunderland, a man who lost his wife but received a letter 3 years later from her requesting him to find her in Silent Hill. The gameplay is not much different from the first game. They still utilize the fog as it became part of the game's lore, and you can find it in almost every Silent Hill. The story is what compelled so many people to love the game. The side characters were well written, and the feel of psychological horror still messes with the players, and the multiple endings and the secret Easter eggs that are found years later. That's part of the reason why it became a cult classic. This just shows how Konami fumbled the bag. You see, Konami created Team Silent from developers who worked in other departments and new employees. After the release of the second Silent Hill, the team was split into two to make Silent Hill 3 and 4 simultaneously. Instead of Konami realizing the potential of the series, they disbanded the team in 2007 after canceling Silent Hill 5. But this is not to take away from the story of Silent Hill 2. The impact it delivered made critics take the genre more seriously, stable in itself as one of the top 5 games of all time. The imagery, the atmosphere is far better than the previous game. Not to mention that they introduced Pyramid Head to the horror world, and people either want to fight him or fuck him. You know, it's always, how's his pyramid gonna feel inside me, and never, how's Pyramid feeling inside. We're gonna move on to the next game, but trust me when I say this, Konami will make a return to this video. 3 months after Silent Hill 2, Fatal Frame is released by Tecmo in Japan and then by Wanadu in Europe. The story is set in 1986. It begins with Mafio, a man fascinated with folklore, who went to the Himuro mansion to search for Jinsei, his mentor and legendary folklorist himself. Mafio brings his family heirloom, a special camera that can see beyond what the normal eye can. As he travels through the empty corridors of the mansion and seeing how powerful the camera is, he attempts to head back to the entrance but gets trapped by an unknown ghost. 2 weeks later, his sister, Miku, heads to the mansion in search of her brother. She finds the camera and begins tracking him down with the help of a little girl in a white kimono. She learns that she has been plagued by the rope curse. We also learned that Himuro Mansion is the entrance to the gates of hell, and every 10 years it begins to open, which will require several rituals to close. The Strangling Ritual, which is used to sacrifice a rope maiden, the Ceremony of the Rope, which is used to seal the gate, the Blinding Ritual, used to weaken any spirits that went through the gate, and finally, the Demon Tag to help choose the next mating. Once the new maiden has been picked, she is then isolated from the world to not grow any attachments. However, the last one, being Kiri Himuro, she fell in love with a man who resembles Mafio, and it's the reason why he is still alive while others have been killed. The game mechanic was derived from the myth that photos capture your soul. So your weapon in the game is a camera, and you can use it to seal the spirits in and save yourself herself from being sacrificed. This playstyle gave a feeling of helplessness. While other horror games gave you weapons, carrying a camera seems less effective. There are 2 original endings and 1 Xbox exclusive ending. The normal ending, where Miku fights Kiri and defeats her, then White Kimono shows up and reminds her of what to do, and then she begins to seal the gate. Miku saves her brother, but he decides to stay because to him, he understood Kiri's struggle and what she went through, so he doesn't want to leave her alone. The second ending is that they escape and Kiri seals the gate and all the spirits return to where they came from. And finally, the Xbox ending, where Miku and her brother escape and then Kiri and her old lover reunite, and it's a small movie being played as photographs. Honestly, this game is incredible for its time. The premise of it gave an extremely fresh outlook on a new way to play. Only downside to so many great Japanese games is that they're stagnant release dates. Some games take months or years before they release worldwide. And for Fatal Frame, it took 9 months to release in Europe. Our next game also suffered the same fate as Fatal Frame. Siren was released in Japan in November 2003 and for North America in April 2004. The story begins in the fictional town in Japan known as Hanuda. Around midnight, an earthquake occurs which interrupts a ritual that was being done in the forest. The village now teeters between the fabric of time and space. The surrounding area becomes covered with an infinite sea of red water. The crux of the story is that the leader of the religion group named Hisekao Yao is trying to resurrect a being known as Darasushi using this ritual. Does it sound familiar yet? The enemies in this game are the residents of the town. After they have submerged themselves in the Red Sea, they come back as subordinates army known as Shiboto. There are 10 different sublocations in Haruda where the story takes place with different characters. While the locations are different, the events that happen in them are chronological and interlinked. For an example, if you use an item or a key to open a door, then the next person might not have the item or simply has a door open for them. Every character has an ability called Sight Jack, where you are able to see through the eyes of Shiboto, humans, or other living creatures. In the game, you are able to use stealth or combat, but the game kinda pushes you to use stealth as much as possible. While it is encouraged, I think it's nice that they give you both options. So now, I will run through all the characters, describing them as fast as I possibly can, because there's 10 of them. Kyoya Soda, curious teenager, wanted to see Ghost, ends up liking a girl and saving her. Taman Takeuchi, 34-year-old man, wanted to write lore, has a gun, and he gives to other 8 survivors. Akira Shimura, outcasted old hunter, hates the local religion, ends up saving people. Ki Makino, 27-year-old twin, priest in the religion, gets killed and trade places with his brother. Shiryu Maita, the twin that killed the other one. Risa Unda, 21-year-old twin, seeks her sister who turned, gets killed by Shiryu who killed his brother already. Jesus, this guy's fucking evil. Harumi Yamoda, 10-year-old psychic, sees dreams of the future and writes them down. Tomoko Maeda, 14-year-old, gets her privacy invaded, runs away from home. Riko Takato, 27-year-old mother, lost her child, blames herself. Naoko Mihama, bitch. This game provided an innovative gameplay style. The connected characters and the interlinked scenarios remind me a lot of the second Disaster Report game, which is one of my favorite gems of the PS2. However, while Siren is creative and provided such a new wave of mechanic, it was short-lived considering that Capcom was cooking in the kitchen. Last moment that Resident Evil provided an experience to players that changed the horror genre forever was when they released the first game. In 2004, they managed to change the genre again, providing us with the best Resident Evil they have ever released, and yes, I will die on this hill. Resident Evil 4 changed a lot when it comes to the genre, from the camera angle to the storyline to the atmosphere to even the guns. Granted, the storyline is a giant ego stroke for Leon. One man goes out of his way to save the president's daughter. He's so hot and sexy, it will make you shit yourself. But it is one of my top 3 games of all time. It's incredible, through and through. The only thing I'm mad about is that the fact the remake changed a lot of the dialogue. It wasn't the worst, but I preferred the charm of the original.
Women.
There's a lot to say about this game, and it almost feels like the video on how it impacted the genre would need two parts of its own. So instead, here are some games that copied or were inspired by Resident Evil: Dead Space, Cold Fear, both Deadly Premonitions, Evil Within 1 and 2, Gears of War, and finally, if it weren't for the existence of Resident Evil 4, Devil May Cry would not see the light of day. But all these games are old at this point. But what about newer impacts? What about the 2010 games? What about the games that changed the genre after the crater that Resident Evil 4 left behind? Well, sadly, newer games don't feel like they change anything. It's like these older games have set the bar so high, no one is reaching for it anymore. They're just going after quick cash grabs. But there are a few outliers, ones that take risk and go beyond the bar and changing the genre yet again. One of those games utilizes what Fatal Frame and Siren and Resident Evil 1 gave us. Enter Outlast. A first-person horror game set in an insane asylum where you can run or hide. You play as Miles Upshur, a journalist who received an anonymous tip about the asylum and headed over to investigate it. Upon arrival, you find a way inside the hospital and walk around a seemingly abandoned building until you walk into a room littered with bodies of what seems to be a task force. One who is still alive tells you that the variants escaped and they killed everyone and that you can't fight them and you have to hide, immediately setting the tone of the game. He then tells you that the only way out is by unlocking the main gate through the security control room. This is where we meet Chris Walker. Just like Silent Hill 2 introduced Pyramid Head, Outlast gave the horror genre a man who can rip you in half. The entire game is hide and seek with enemies. It gave me a fright that I have not felt in a very long time. Most horror games after Resident Evil 4 lost the feeling of what makes them scary. Outlast does a very good job giving you the stimulation that you get from scaring yourself. Most ratings for this game have been 7 and higher. In case you were curious on how well it sold, the first game sold around 5 million copies on Steam alone. This is another feature that I really liked about the game. Miles' personality only shows in the notes he writes. He never speaks other than grunting and screaming for pain as he gets his fingers cut off, which I thought was ideal for a game like this. It made the focus on the villains more apparent than the sanity of our character. And believe me, besides the horrible things that happened to him physically, the man was not right in the head by the end of the game. Okay, so quick recap. We talked about different types of horror apart from two: jump scare horror and multiplayer horror. And so far, I've been keeping things based on the release dates. However, I will be moving the jump scare horror subgenre to the end of the video for a reason you will know later. Right now, I want to bring up Konami again. I told you it was going to make a comeback. I hope you remembered. Konami has a very interesting method of fumbling the bag on multiple occasions. I told you already how Team Silent was made by bringing in different people from different departments. Well, most of those people were gone before 2007 when they were disbanded. They could have made more money if they put their time and effort into Team Silent, but to them, it was a side project. And thankfully, they hired really passionate people. In 2014, they fumbled what could have possibly been their biggest bag as of yet. Konami is responsible for publishing the Metal Gear series, and the man behind the series is Hideo Kojima, arguably one of the best directors in video game history. So when he offered to take the IP of Silent Hill under his wing and give the horror genre something so incredibly well made and crafted in the simplest way imaginable, they said no. Now, I don't know why they said no. Maybe he was asking for too much money. Maybe he slept with someone's wife. Maybe he walks around naked in the company, and that's an HR nightmare. But when you release a demo that had received such high praise and still discussed even in this video, why didn't you just suck it up and give the man what he wants? PT was by far one of the best demos released for a horror game to this day, and Konami somehow managed to fumble it yet again. I just hope in a different timeline, Kojima was able to give PT to the people. In terms of multiplayer horror, the first game that comes to mind is Left 4 Dead 2. You can pick to play either a special zombie or play as one of the survivors. But in 2016, Dead by Daylight released and cemented its name as the only asymmetrical horror game 4 versus 1 style that started out with a positive reception. DBD takes place in different locations controlled by the entity. Every killer and survivor has their own lore as to why they were summoned. Not only that, but the entire game is a treasure trove for the best licensed killers. You got Michael Myers, Chucky, Xenomorph, Albert Wesker, Demogorgon, Pig from Saw, Ghostface, Pinhead, and even Pyramid Head. Yes, all of you people who wanna shake your ass for Pyramid Head, you can. But in 2017, Friday the 13th came out. And if you remember at the start of the video when I mentioned that licensed games are guaranteed success due to a pre-existing fan base, well, at the time, Dead by Daylight didn't have many licensed killers. And at some point, Friday the 13th got into a dispute over copyright and has not settled yet. And even if it does, there is no good competitor to Dead by Daylight. There have been VHS, The Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Killer Clowns from Outer Space, and Last Year. Most of those games are either gone, dying, or the player count is too low to be a threat. And while Dead by Daylight has a lot of issues with its coding, or just the developers are too high-strung to listen to anyone, or just don't care, the game is very fun to play as a killer. And when it started out, it was a horror game. And now it feels more scary to be the killer than the survivor. The gameplay teeters between killer-sided with some updates to being survivor-sided on other updates. They still have not found a good balance in between, but it is far better today than when it came out. You really don't want to know what the flashlights used to do. Before we get into our final segment, I want to do some honorable mentions. Games that made an impact, but not as much as the others here. Starting out with Castlevania 1986. If you enjoy killing vampires and like platformers, then you'll enjoy this old-timey gem. System Shock 1994, Hall of Fame in the horror genre. Using a 3D engine, the gameplay was innovative and influential. Silent Hill 3 2003. Out of the entire series, I find this game to have one of the best character development and best soundtrack. Manhunt 2003, one of Rockstar's most banned games, deserved to be on everyone's top 10 list. Obscure 2004, was called a Resident Evil clone, but does have a compelling storyline and pretty decent voice acting. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2004. If you want to play a good vampire game, avoid Vampire, play the Masquerade. Dead Rising 2006. Open world zombie game where anything can be used as a weapon. Can't go wrong with this one. Amnesia 2010. Barrels. Cry of Fear 2013. A free game made by extremely passionate people. Play it, it's on Steam, it will be worth your time. Alien Isolation 2014. A game that to this day looks like it was made recently. A game that is truly built to last. Until Dawn 2015. Great story, great characters, new mechanics that made it super fun. Soma 2015. I don't know why, but I refuse to touch that game. Whatever is going on with it, I don't want to find out. The Walking Dead Satan Sinners 2020. One of the best VR experiences I've ever had, not counting the hentai ones. So far on this list, apart from the honorable mentions, most games have been developed by big studios and had a massive budget, but that doesn't mean smaller games can make a big impact. And I wanted to save this till the very end because in recent years, I've seen indie developers create something larger than themselves and still make an impact. Not as big as the studios with the huge marketing budget, but an impact nonetheless. Capcom and Konami have made movies and TV shows based on their games, so you wouldn't think that an indie developer could create something that reaches that level. Until Scott Cawthon, the man who made Five Nights at Freddy's. What started out as an independent jump scare game made by one person turned into a lovable franchise with multiple games and a movie made about it. But while FNAF made a massive impact on the horror genre, I think it'll be more fair to mention other indie games that have more passion than most AAA games these days. And to start this segment, I picked Visage, developed and published by Sad Square Studios, a small team that created a spiritual successor to PT. The game is set in 1985 and split into 4 chapters. You play as Dwayne Anderson, who shot and killed his wife and daughter and eventually himself. 3 weeks later, he wakes up in a bloody empty room, not the British way, actual blood, to a voice message from his neighbor who has not seen anyone out of their house in a while. The first chapter talks about Lucy, a little girl who befriended a demon that used TV and radio to talk to her. Under his influence, she killed her pet bird by biting its head off. Then her parents sent her to therapy, and after being injected by several syringes to calm her down, the demon tormented her dormant state of mind until she locked herself in the bathroom and ripped her own jaw off. I don't want to spoil anymore, but the entire game was funded through Kickstarter. I think you should play it and enjoy what PT inspired. The second pick is Omori, made by Omocat in 2020. The game is considered psychological horror that teeters between the real world and the imaginary world. You play as Sunny in the real world and Omori in the imaginary one. The game is turn-based battle system that uses unconventional status effects based on the character's emotions, such as anxiety, depression, trauma, self, and suicide. The gameplay also utilizes a rock, paper, scissors type system during battles, in which certain emotions are strong or weak against each other. But just like the previous game, this one was also funded through Kickstarter and had a lot of development difficulties before releasing fully in 2020. I'll give you a short summary of the game and try to avoid spoilers. Sonny does something bad. He then represses the bad thing until he forgets, and eventually his mind breaks. That's the best I can do without any spoilers. It's a great game that I 100% recommend. It has multiple endings and it's $20 on Steam with over 65,000 positive reviews. But not just the consumers agree that this game is great. Nintendo Life gave it an 8 out of 10 stars, PC Gamer gave it an 80 out of 100, and the least trusted website these days, IGN, gave it a 9.1. First time I've seen IGN give an accurate review. Omori received honorable mentions in the 2021 Independent Game Festival and won the Daringly Dramatic Award in 2021 Dreamies. In terms of sales, it sold almost 3,000 physical copies for the Switch within its first week of release in Japan, making it the 19th best-selling game that week. And in 2022, they announced that Omori sold over 1 million copies on their Twitter page. So many great things to say about it, but not without spoiling anything. And I will try my best to not spoil any of these indie games. Our third pick for this genre is Signalis is a top-down shooter survival horror game released in 2022, developed by Rose Engine and published by Humble Games, receiving positive reviews on release. It takes place in the future where time travel became possible with advanced technology, and it isn't in our solar system, but in a similar gravitational planetary system. It's governed by totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a political system and a form of government that prohibits opposition political parties, disregards and outlaws the political claims of individual and group opposition to the state, and controls the public sphere and private sphere of society. You play as Alistair, an android replica unit that awakens after the shuttle crashes on an unknown planet. Your first mission is to locate your partner, Ariana Young. The androids in the game have a copy of human neural imprints. It's a means to keep as the bulk of military force and labor. The consequence to this is that these androids inherit their human imprint desires, from wanting to sleep, to listen to music, to taking a bath, and if the android does not follow through these desires, they will destabilize and stop functioning. Signalis also has overwhelming positive reviews on Steam, but also from critics. PC Gamer gave it a 92 out of 100, Nintendo Life gave it a 9 out of 10 stars, and Polygon recommends it. And so do I. The game has been nominated 22 times and won 6 awards. These include Best Indie Horror and Best Narrative in 2023 Horror Game Awards, Best Audio Design and Best Debut for the German Computer Game Awards, and finally, the Best Hidden Gem for the 12th Annual New York Game Awards. If nothing I said had convinced you to play this game, then maybe this will. Please do it, Mr. Please. County is a survival horror released in 2024 by SFB Games. It's set in a similar style to old horror games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. The year is 1990 and you play as Mara Forrest, a special agent who is investigating an abandoned amusement park named Crow County in hopes of finding the founder, Edward Crow, that disappeared 2 years prior shutting down. The reason behind shutting the park down was a 15-year-old girl, Elaine Marshall, who was injured during these zombie-like creatures known as guests. Upon Mara's investigation, she finds a dig site that seems to be providing pure gold from a root-like structure. In order to cover the tracks where the gold is coming from, Crow and Marvin bought a dried-up gold mine in Brazil to cover their tracks. The reception for the game was overwhelmingly positive from the consumers to the critics. Metacritic gave it a 84 out of 100. The Guardian gave it a 5 out of 5, and Screen Rant giving it a 9 out of 10. The game is focused on exploration and puzzle solving. It also provides a mode where it dispenses the enemies and allows the player to explore an eerie PS1 style game set in the 90s. This game is also $20 on Steam, and I do recommend you take a look into it. If you miss PlayStation 1 games or just want to experience them without the clunky controls of old games, Crow County has you covered. But since we are talking about the 90s, let's keep up with the theme and talk about an upcoming indie game that I am personally excited for. Holston is a top-down third-person psychological horror. Yes, you heard me right. Developed by Sonka, a team out of Poland, and the entire game is set in an isolated, eerie Polish town in the 90s. You play as Tomasz, who's seeking out answers for the disappearance of his friend, and you learn that most people in the town are possessed by something foul, with tendrils coming out of the floor and causing you damage once you get close, to enemies that take multiple hits to try and kill you. Holston provides both top-down for exploration and over-the-shoulder camera for combat. This is actually the second game on this list that allowed two perspectives. The first game I mentioned was Shiryu Sensen War of the Dead, all the way back in 1987. It provided top-down exploring and 2D for combat. Everything about the demo left me wanting more, from the sound design to the visuals to even the voice acting. They all speak Polish, and while I don't understand the language, I do understand what kurwa means. So every time I hear it, I know someone is either really upset or really horny. I may be a bit biased here when I say that indie games are the reason horror is staying fresh these days. You have so many sites that push forward indie devs, biggest one being Itch.io, an entire hub for everything indie, from horror to RPG to some very interesting titles. The entire site is a treasure trove of finding new gems. Hopefully, you can find one of your own. And we have reached the conclusion of our massive list. Hopefully, I provided you with enough intrigue to want to try some of these games I recommended, like Omori and Signalis. There are more indie games out there that I know I neglected to mention that had huge successes, but that's what I'm hoping you tell me. Maybe you know of a game that shifted the genre that I forgot to mention. I would love to know. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until this point, I will return with another video in the future if I come up with any ideas. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.